as Paul gets into chapter 5, he begins by talking to Timothy about how he was to treat others. Particularly, he's talking about his fellow Christians. And he's going to be using language that describes a family-type relationship that he is to have with these other Christians. So in 1 Timothy chapter 5, beginning in verse 1, he says, "Do not sharply rebuke an older man, but rather appeal to him as a father, to younger men as brothers, to older women as mothers, and the younger women as sisters in all purity." So as Paul is describing the different types of relationships that Timothy is going to have with those in the church, he begins by talking about the older men. You treat the older men as fathers. To do this would require Timothy to exhibit a degree of humility. In 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 12, Paul had talked to Timothy about how he was to be an example of those who believe and not let anyone look down on his youth. Now, the way he would do that would be by conducting himself in the way that was proper and the way that was right. Well, this is related to that. When you think about Timothy as a younger preacher, and there may be those who are in the church who may need to receive correction. He's talking about sharply rebuke an older man. He says don't sharply rebuke them. They may need to be corrected. But he says you are to appeal to them as fathers. Exhibit humility in this. Don't act in such a way that as a young man, they resent you for the way that you treat them or the way that you come across. So there may need to be correction. There may need to be things that are changed, but do not sharply rebuke them, but rather treat them as if you would your own father. To the younger men, he says treat them as brothers. That there is an equality here, that even though Timothy was a preacher of the gospel, that did not put him at a level of higher importance than everyone else. He had a special role to play. He had an important work to do, but he was not more important than the others. And so he was not to act as though he was better than his peers. He was to treat the younger men as brothers. Older women, he says, treat as mothers. This is similar to the instruction about how he was to treat the older men, because this brings with it the idea of respect and humility, that he was to treat the older women in this way. And the younger women, says you treat them as sisters. Again, we can make a similar point with the younger men, treat them as brothers, that there is an equality here. But he adds this point here that he says you treat them this way in all purity. Timothy as a young man, and as he's interacting with and associating with those who are the younger women, he needed to make sure that he was conducting himself in all purity. Not to lust after them, not to mistreat them, not to abuse them. We have seen cases, especially in the news, it seems that this has been coming out more, where people have used their position, those in religious organizations and churches have used their position in order to engage in some type of sexual abuse and many times cover it up and get away with that. Paul would head that off here with this instruction. Paul tells Timothy, you treat younger women as sisters in all purity. Treat them as if you would your own sister. Protect them. Protect their honor. Don't use them. Don't mistreat them. And so in all of these things, Paul is telling Timothy, you are to treat these others in the church as if they were your own family, because in a sense they are. They are a spiritual family. So you treat them in this way. Then after this is a fairly lengthy passage about the care of widows. So we're going to go read through several of these verses, and then we'll go back and kind of break it up into two parts. But we'll begin in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 3. He says, honor widows who are widows indeed. But if any widow have children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family, and to make some return to their parents, for this is good and acceptable in the sight of God. Now she who is a widow indeed, and who has been left alone, has fixed her hope on God, and continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. But she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. Prescribe these things as well, so that they may be above reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. A widow is to be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted those in distress, and if she has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to put younger widows on the list, for when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ, they want to get married, thus incurring condemnation because they have set aside their previous pledge. At the same time, they also learn to be idle, as they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. Therefore, I want younger widows to get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no occasion for reproach, for some have already turned aside to follow Satan. If any woman who is a believer has dependent widows, she must assist them, and the church must not be burdened, so that it may assist those who are widows indeed. So as we go back through here, and we're going to break this up again in two parts, where he's going to talk about the care of widows, but there are two types of widows that he talks about here. One are the widows indeed. He says, honor those who are widows indeed. There are other types of widows that would be cared for in another way. But he's talking about what the church was going to be doing on an ongoing basis. Now, as far as temporary measures and care and support that would be given to someone in need, that can be done for any widow in the church or others who are not widows in the church. The church may do that on a temporary basis. But here in this passage, he's talking about something where these widows will be put on a list or on a roll where they would be cared for in an ongoing manner by the church. And these widows, he identifies as those who are widows indeed. Well, how does he describe these widows here in this passage? Well, he says that these are ones who have been left alone, and they have put their trust in God. So these are ones who are Christians, and they are Christians but have no one in their family who can help. The church is a last resort, and we'll talk about that more here as we go on in this passage. But she has been left alone, but she has put her trust in God. She is a faithful Christian. She is one who focuses on spiritual things. She continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. And she is not one who gives herself over to wanton pleasure. She's focused on spiritual things and not on physical things or worldly things or carnal things. She is putting the things of God first. There are also requirements here about her age and her family and her background that would be, if these were not the case for a particular woman here, then there would be another way for this situation to be handled. But for this particular situation, for those who are widows indeed, where she would be eligible for the ongoing support and care by the church, he says that she is not to be less than 60 years old. She has to be the wife of one man. She has to have brought up children. So she has different things that she has demonstrated in her life as far as her marriage and her family, that she is of a certain age. And also she has been dedicated to good works. She has shown hospitality. She has washed the saints' feet. She has assisted those in distress. At the beginning of verse 10, it says that she has a reputation for good works. This is what she is known for. The end of that verse says she has devoted herself to every good work. So this is what her character is. This is what she is known for. These are the ones that are to be cared for. Again, this is not on a temporary basis. There may be others who can be provided for and given assistance on a temporary basis. This is about ongoing support and help, that these ones will be cared for by the church. Well, what about other widows, those who are not widows indeed, as Paul defined it here in this passage? What about other widows? Because there would be ones who would not meet all of those qualifications. There would be different situations and different ones that could potentially care for them, or they may be younger or something like that. Well, Paul gives instructions about those situations as well. So for the care of other widows, it says if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family, and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. That this is God's plan. When it talks about being acceptable in the sight of God, this is not just something that God permits or God just thinks is a good idea. That this is His design. His design is for families to take care of their own. So when you have a woman who has lost her husband, who should be the ones who naturally step in to take care of her? It should be the children and the grandchildren. This is how God designed the family to work. And He said there in verse 8, the men are to provide for their household. If anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So this is a serious responsibility. This is not something to be taken lightly. And when it talks about he needs to provide for his own, he did not say he just needs to provide for himself. He needs to provide for his own, meaning his own household, for those of his household, which would include those who might be in need. These widows who are in his household. It could be a mother. It could be a grandmother. He is to provide for them. He's not just to go out and work and earn just enough to provide for himself. No, he is to work more than that and earn more than that so that he can provide for other people as well, others in his family in particular. Then he addresses those who are younger widows. He says, I want the younger widows to get married, to bear children, to keep the house, and to give the enemy no occasion for reproach. When God designed marriage and the home in the beginning, this was the role that God had given to the women. This was the work that he had given them to do. Now, the older widows, those who are 60 and older, they've already done that work. The younger widows, they haven't spent their life doing this. Paul says, I want them to do that. This is what God's design is. This is what he intends. And this is also to help avoid trouble, to give the enemy no occasion for reproach. There would not be temptations and allegations and situations that may arise that would cause problems in the church. He says, I want the younger widows to get married, that they are to fulfill that role. They are to be engaged in that work. And then in verse 16, as he closes out this section, he talks about how the church is not to be burdened unnecessarily. He says there in verse 16, if any woman who is a believer has dependent widows, she must assist them, and the church must not be burdened, so that it may assist those who are widows indeed. So he's already talked about early in the chapter, those who have children or those who are children or grandchildren, they are to help these widows. A man who is out working to provide for his own and for those of his household, he is to provide for these widows. The woman here in verse 16, she is to help provide for these widows, provide help for them. He says the church is not to be burdened. I mentioned earlier that the church is almost a last resort, or we can see it that way, that it is a last resort. He says that they are to assist those who are widows indeed. But if they have others who can care for them, particularly family, they are to be the ones who step in and care for them. When we think about the work that the Lord has given the church to do, we saw earlier in the study in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15 that the church is the pillar and support of the truth. This is, in a nutshell, what the church is to be doing. Well, the more that the church is involved in the work of benevolence, then the more resources are diverted away from the primary work of spreading the gospel and teaching the word of God and building up the brethren. Now, it may be authorized in certain cases to do that. And the church should care for these widows in these situations that Paul is talking about here. But the more that these responsibilities can be taken by others, children, grandchildren, the men, the women, rather than the church, then the more the church is going to be able to take care of its work, including caring for those who are widows indeed, but also the larger work that the church is involved in of preaching the gospel and building up the body of Christ.